I'm Megan Sweeney. I'm one of the associate directors here at CCPR, and I just wanted to officially welcome everyone to what I think is our 7th annual Mayor Lecture Award. Many of you in the room knew Rob Mayer. For those of you who didn't, he was a distinguished professor of sociology here at UCLA. He was the founding director of CCPR, which he led from 1998 to 2004. Rob was a renowned scholar, a superb colleague, and an extraordinary mentor. And it is really that aspect of Rob's contributions that we're honoring today. Every year since 2018, we've selected a graduating PhD student to deliver the Mayer Lecture. Before I turn the floor over to Adriana to introduce this year's winner of the lectureship, I just wanted to remind everyone that we do have a reception to immediately follow the lecture right next door in the CCPR space. And we'll use that time to come together collectively and celebrate some other awards at the center. So I hope you'll join us for that as well. So thank you, everyone. And let me turn over the floor to Adriana.
Hi, welcome. It's my great pleasure to introduce Victoria Wang, who is my student and who is soon to graduate. Vicky comes to us after having completed a BA from Rice University and a master's in social sciences from Chicago. And then she came to us. And Vicky is part of a cohort that has faced a lot of significant financial and personal adversity through the pandemic and decreasing funding. And I am very proud to say that Vicky has met these challenges incredibly. And I'm very proud of her. She has raised significant amounts of money for her research and her living expenses. And she has been very entrepreneurial in obtaining data and pushing her research. And she was able to get an internship at the Federal Reserve, among other things. And she will be graduating soon to go for a postdoc at NYU and then for an assistant professor at Wesley. And so, Vicky, congratulations on all your achievements and thank you for being here. Thank you.
Okay, hello everyone. Can you hear me okay? Should it be louder? Okay. So thank you for being here. Thank you for the very kind introduction, Adriana, and I'm really grateful and honored to be able to give this talk. And so I'm going to be presenting my job market paper, which is now titled Adaptive Migration in the Face of Wildfires, Financial Constraints and the Role of Government Aid. All right, so all of us live in LA, so this probably doesn't need that much of an introduction, but we know that natural disasters, especially wildfires, are very destructive and expensive. And so we had the fires back in January, but this wasn't an isolated incident. Within California, 10 of the 20 largest wildfires that have happened on record have happened since 2020. And worldwide in 2023, 93.1 million people were impacted and affected by natural disasters overall. And so with climate change, these disasters are expected to become both more frequent and more severe. So we're expecting to impact even more people. And additionally, a lot of government aid has been dedicated to disaster relief. So in 2023, for California wildfires alone, $103 million were given through FEMA aid. Of course, the individuals and governments can take a lot of measures in order to minimize and mitigate the costs associated with these disasters. And so one such adaptation strategy is what I'm calling adaptive migration. And so in order to just like confirm terms, what I mean by adaptive migration is if people are moving from risky to safe areas permanently. And so in order for this to happen, 2 things need to be going on. The first is that people need to be moving away from these risky places. And the second one is that they need to be moving to these safe areas. And so in order for adaptive migration to be happening, both of these things need to be true. And I focus on this because adaptive migration is theorized to be a key mitigation strategy. And this is because of the spatial nature of climate change. So there will be certain areas that are expected to become more dangerous, while others will actually become safer. And so because of this, you can imagine that if we're moving populations to these safe areas, we can lower the cost of these natural disasters. So in theory, right, this sounds wonderful, but in practice, do people actually adaptively migrate? And so this is where my job market paper comes in. So I provide novel empirical evidence about the extent of adaptive migration. And just to really hone it into your minds, I'm answering the two questions. First of all, how much are people moving? And then the second one, really considering where are people moving to? This contributes to, of course, the existing literature on natural disasters, but I build upon it because the existing literature typically only focuses on the migration aspect, and they measure things based off of population changes as evidence of this movement. Additionally, the migration that they're studying is typically on the county level. And so my paper builds on this because I'm able to not only look at migration, but also where people are moving to, and I'm providing the first causal estimates of this adaptive migration after a natural disaster. I'm doing this using individual level, geographically detailed panel data. And in particular, I'm looking at people from the census block to the census block level. This is important because, first of all, in the United States, the majority of migration that happens is within a county. And so I'm able to capture that type of migration. And second of all, within a county, there can be a lot of variation in terms of wildfire risk. And so to really be able to measure this, this geographically detailed data is very necessary for this question. Moreover, I'm able to study a longer time period. So I'm able to look up to 4 years in the future of the disaster happening. And so I can look beyond the initial, people might be forced away because, they're literally having to evacuate, and then seeing in the longer term where their location choices are. The second thing that my project does is that I conduct some heterogeneity analyses to investigate and highlight financial constraints as a potential barrier to adaptive migration. This is important because the wide literature that's growing, that's looking at these dynamic spatial equilibrium models, are assuming that people are making their preferred migration decisions. And so my paper, I'm highlighting and considering the importance that people might be constrained financially, and that could be preventing them from moving in the way that they might want to. And that might be a potential barrier to this adaptive migration. And given that, you can imagine that there is a role for the government to step in and to provide disaster aid, and that could encourage certain types of behavior. And so this is the third part of my project. And one thing to note is that there's actually very little causal evidence of the impact of government aid on migration alone. So there is a recent Journal of Economic Literature review article that was looking at internal migration within the United States, and they really highlight that there's very little understanding of what is the impact of government aid on people's location choices. There are some papers that look at very targeted small-scale programs, usually after a hurricane like Hurricane Katrina, and seeing how that impacts people's likelihood of returning. And there's also another literature that is more descriptive in nature. And what I mean by that is to try and understand their results. They hypothesize that government aid could be the reason why we see people's decisions, but they don't ever link the aid directly to people's outcomes and the understanding of the migration. And so my paper, I'm able to provide causal evidence about the impact of government aid on a large program. And I show that it does not facilitate this adaptive migration. The program in question that I'm looking at is FEMA's Individual and Households Program, the IHP. And I focus on this because it's the largest disaster aid transfer program that is given directly to individuals. So you can imagine that this can help people be mobilized and do what they want to do because we're giving the money directly to them. And I'm able to get the causal effect of this because I have an instrument. And this is a novel implementation of this instrument. And in particular, I'm going to be taking advantage of the fact that there's electoral incentives for aid and using that as my variation. So I'm able to do all of these things because I had awesome data access, thanks to CPL Retail. And it's open to everyone who is a UC affiliate. So I highly recommend looking into this. And so I'm using individual level geographically granular panel data. So I'm able to track people over time and really see where their locations are, and a stacked difference in differences event study methodology. And of course, the setting is wildfires in California. All right, so just to give some background about California, I'll go through it fast, but wildfires in California are typically concentrated in several certain areas. So this map is showing you the California wildfires from 2000 to 2009, from 2010 to 2019, and then from 2020 to 2024. So this last map does not capture the most recent wildfires. But as you can see over time, right, like there are certain areas that tend to burn again and again. But there's also this like spreading of where the wildfires are going. And so this is very related to the idea, right, that fire spreads, it needs fuel. The fuel that we're thinking of is like the topography, the geography of the area. And so you can imagine that this wildfire risk is predictable in some way, but with rising temperatures and people building closer to these areas, the likelihood of people and the spread is getting larger and larger. And we expect this to get worse with climate change. And then finally, to try and think about like what exactly this wildfire shock is and how to think about this wildfire. So of course, a wildfire can do a lot of things. The first is, of course, it could damage your home. It could decrease your location amenities. And so what I mean by that is that it could, affect the surrounding infrastructure, or it could ruin your view. So maybe you don't want to live there anymore. It could change the cost of living and your employment opportunities. So if you're in an industry that's very tied to what the area looks like, tourism and things like that, your employment could be impacted from this disaster. And it could also update people's beliefs about the riskiness of the area. So if you're living there and you thought you could be safe, and then suddenly this fire happens, you might imagine that in the future, it could get worse. And so all of these factors altogether is bundled into what I'm calling this wildfire shock. And so for my project, I don't have survey data, so it's a little bit more difficult for me to understand like when this happens, how do people respond and think about this, although I'll try and get at the individual components of this a little bit. But the most important, and I think, again, going back to this idea of adaptive migration, right? So there are many reasons why people might want to move, but given that this fire like forces them to move, at least like evacuate in some way, are they moving to these safe areas? And so in order to do this, I have to combine a lot of data sources. So the first, I already gave a shout out to CPL. So it's my migration and demographic data comes from the University of California Consumer Credit Panel, or the UCCCP. So this has census block location data, and I'm using it from 2014 to 2021. It also includes demographic background information such as the gender, age, the education, marital status, and people's credit scores. And I'm using this data to construct my first measure, the migration measure, which I call as if you moved away from the tract. And so I define this as if you're seen at a different tract from where you were the year before the fire happens. The second part is at the adaptation part of the adaptive migration. And so in order to have that, we need to have some idea of wildfire risk. And so that data comes from the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA. And they publish a census tract level score about wildfire risk, and it's roughly a uniform distribution. And so I define you moving to like a safe place is if you're in a low or medium wildfire risk area, which is if your FEMA wildfire score is in like the bottom half of that distribution. And of course, we need wildfire information to study these wildfires. And so that data comes from the California Department of Forestry and Fire Protection. And so they have wildfire shapefile boundaries all the way going back to 1950. And so I use those to define whether and combine it with the census block information to see if that individual is impacted by the fire. And so for my empirical strategy, I'm going to be defining a treatment and a control group to be people who are living in an area that has the same wildfire risk, but one of them is impacted by the fire and the other is not. And in particular, I'm going to be looking at census blocks that are burned for the first time. And so it's the first time that I see that that block is burned. And then I'm comparing it to people living in blocks that are never burned, all within the same census tract. And so I like this specification because, like I mentioned, by definition, they have the same wildfire risk score based off of, the data that I have that's on the census tract level. And also, I'm going to be conducting an event study so I can really track people's migration decisions over time. And by using this never burn group as my control group, it addresses these concerns that maybe if we're using it's just a very clean control group and it's very easily understandable what exactly I'm comparing in my outcomes.
When you say never, what's the time range of never?
Yeah, so the time
How far
range,
back does it go?
it goes, I use it all the way back to 1950. So if it's the first burned since 1950 and then never burned, but I do a robustness check of like within, it doesn't have to go all the way back then as well. Yeah, so yes. So this is what you'll be seeing a lot of graphs later, and it says first versus never. So I want you to keep in mind it's people in blocks that are burned for the first time compared to people in blocks that were never burned that are nearby. And so, like I mentioned before, my empirical strategy is a stacked difference in differences event study. So this is a mouthful, so I'll go through it piece by piece. The first thing to realize is the outcome variable is on the individual level. So it's for an individual I outcome at a given calendar year T for a given fire. So I'm defining the fire as for if your census tract was burned and you're living in a block that's within that burned tract that was burned for the first time. So that's going to be a 1 and a 0 if you're in the never burned group. I include individual fixed effects to account for differences in individual migration probabilities. And I also have these relative year fixed effects. And so this is an indicator that the individual experienced the fire F at some given time, some given year. And then I'm tracking like them throughout time. So before they experienced the fire and then after the fire. So this fire is my treatment. So it is an indicator if you're living in the block that experienced a given fire. And the coefficient of interest is this beta R term. So in the graphs I'll be showing you, this is what I'm plotting. So that is showing how people are moving differentially based off of whether they experienced that fire or not. I also include calendar year fixed effects to account for just general trends changes that are happening over time. And then also some demographic information that might be changing over time that is varying with the individual fixed effect. And because my fire and my treatment is defined at the census block level, I'm going to be clustering everything by at the census block. And so in order for this strategy to work, we have to have the parallel trends assumption between the treated and the control groups. And so I think there's some pretty strong evidence that this assumption is a good one. The first is just the way that wildfires work. So the exact trajectory of them is essentially random because of exogenous factors such as your wind direction, and especially at like such a fine geographic level. And the second part is I'll show you direct evidence in the next slide that there's actually very similar migration rates before the fire between these two groups, and then afterwards you see like a stark jump. And so this is a graph that's showing you the percent of people who moved away from their tract. And this is the dotted line is for the control group, so people living in never burned blocks. There's this like V shape that's 0 at -1, because if you recall, I'm defining everything relative to where you were the year before the fire. So by definition, no one has moved away from their tract the year before the fire. And then as time goes on, people are more likely to move in or move out. And so that's why there's this like V shape. And then the straight line is for people who are living in blocks that burn for the first time. So you can see time 0 is the time of the fire. And so before the fire, not only are they parallel, but they're virtually, overlapping the same. And then after the fire, there's this like stark jump within the treated group. And then it kind of persists even up to 4 years after the fire. So this is just hopefully giving you some feeling okay about my identification strategy and showing evidence that this is a good control group for this kind of outcome. And then to more formally test this, these are the beta coefficients of my stacked difference in differences event study regression. And so you can see that people that are in these blocks that burn for the first time are 10.7 percentage points or 50% almost more likely to move away after 2 years of the fire. And even 4 years after the fire, they have a 6.5 percentage point increase or around 20% increase in the likelihood of like staying away. So people that are impacted by the fire are moving and staying away even 4 years after. But again, it's not enough that they're moving away. They need to be moving to these safe places. And so this is plotting the second outcome, which is whether they're in a low or medium wildfire score. And so you can see immediately after the fire, there's like this increase in the probability. There are 5.5 percentage points or almost 25% more likely to move to a safe area. But after 4 years, this falls to 1.7 percentage points and it's statistically insignificant. So it seems that people are moving to safe places, but then in the longer term, they're not. And so how do I think about these results? This is evidence that people are moving and staying away. And they're initially in these safe areas, but it's not true after 4 years. And this is because people are moving away after the fire and then they do another move. And so I see in my data for 20% of those who moved the year of the fire, they eventually returned to the burn tract by the 4th year. So that is one group of people. But the other group is like these people who continue to move. So they initially moved to a safe area and then they moved again, and this time not to a safe area. And so it's robust to a lot of different specifications. And then to think more carefully about, okay, why aren't people moving adaptively? I try and think about what does it take for people to move in this way. And so there's 2 components. The first is preferences. So people need to want to move to these safe areas. And the second is their constraints. And so they need to be able to move to these areas. And the constraint part is important because places that are safer also tend to be more expensive. I know maybe in people's minds with the recent fires, we think about, the Pacific Palisades. It doesn't seem like it's a very risky place, but it doesn't seem very cheap. But overall in California and also around the United States, places that tend to be safer also tend to be more expensive. And so of course there's some variation, but the housing prices have this kind of correlation. And so the thought experiment is that for financially unconstrained groups, they're more able to act in line with their preferences. And so I try and see and try and get at this like preferences people might have by looking at groups that are least likely to be financially constrained. So there are 2 groups that I'm looking at. The first are people with like a high credit score because, they can use institutions to try and help them. And also like credit score is a correlate to income. And the second group is these people who are likely to have a post-fire payment. And so what I mean by this is I have also another data set that allows me to look at address level migration. And I also have a data set of homes that are identified to be damaged. And so I link those together. And I'm assuming that the people who are in a burned area and their home is damaged, they're more likely to have access to insurance, right, than someone whose home was not damaged, but were in that burned area. And so for that reason, I think of these 2 groups as these like financially unconstrained groups. And to test the differences between them, now I'm doing an interactive stack difference and differences event study. So essentially, I just have an indicator that the individual belongs to that group. So whether they're a high credit score or their home was damaged. And then there's another indicator that for people who did not belong to that group, and then the inside part is the stack difference and differences. So I'll just show you the coefficients of that in a slide. So what I find is that for people of both high and low credit scores, they're more likely to be moving and to stay away after the wildfire. So it doesn't seem that credit score is like preventing people from having to move, but it's only those who are high credit who are more likely to be in safe areas after 4 years. And so this is suggestive evidence, right? Maybe financial constraints could be part of this question. I see further evidence of this by looking at those whose homes are damaged. And so you see that there is, of course, if your home is damaged, you have a much higher likelihood of moving away. But even if your home wasn't damaged, your people are still moving away. But it's only people whose homes are damaged who are more likely to be in these like safe areas in the longer term. And so this is, I take as another like piece of suggestive evidence that these constraints could be preventing people from moving to these safe places. And so there's a lot of other differences in people's adaptive migration. And also thinking a little bit more, okay, people might not be moving to these like safe places. What are kind of the characteristics of where they're moving to? So people tend to be moving to areas with like higher median household income, higher average test scores. So there's, But they also happen to have like higher housing costs, both in terms of the housing value and the average rent. And so all of that data is coming from the Opportunity Atlas. And it seems that people are pushed into these like better neighborhoods, but they're much less likely to have a mortgage. So it could be that they're moving to these places, but at the cost of home ownership. Okay, so given that people aren't moving to these safe places, but financial constraints could be preventing them to, there could be an argument made about the role of disaster aid to help them overcome this financial constraint. And so I'm looking at the FEMA Individuals and Households Program. And so just to give you some background about it, the amount of aid for a wildfire disaster is capped to be around $35,000 during this time period. But the average amount of aid that is received for an individual that you see in the data is around $10,000. So just to give you some sense of like how much money is actually being allocated. But in order for individuals to receive aid, there needs to be a lot of things that happen. And the first thing is that the president needs to call a disaster declaration for a county to be able to mobilize FEMA. And then after it's been mobilized, that's when individuals can apply for aid. But this is a very onerous and very annoying application process that requires extensive documentation. And people can also specifically apply for different types of aid. So you can have aid to repair your home. You can have aid that's for short-term rental assistance, and then something called like other needs assistance, which also includes like moving expenses. And so you can imagine that people, depending on what they want to do, might be applying for different types of aid, which can cause some concern about like selection and thinking about the impact of this aid. After you've applied for aid, FEMA will then send officers to inspect the damage and then determine the amount of aid that you'll be given. And then finally, individuals receive aid. And so there's this big endogeneity concern, right? That aid is not as good as random. So just comparing individuals that experienced a fire that receives aid with those that experienced a fire that didn't receive aid won't give us the causal effect of aid. And so to get around this, I use an instrument for aid, which I call political competitiveness. And I'm using the fact that there are electoral incentives to instrument for aid. So within the economic history and political science literature, they found that for places that are more close, they can get more attention, and there are a lot of benefits to the political parties for giving people this money. And so I'm using this to get at the first stream of what you need to think about and to receive aid in the first place, and the fact that the president needs to call a disaster declaration, but they're able to like unilaterally do that. And the instrument I'm doing is the county's political competitiveness. And so what do I mean by this? This is if the margin of victory in the most recent past presidential election is within 5%. So I am getting this data from the MIT election labs. And so this, in order for this instrument to work, it needs to be both relevant and follow the exclusion restriction. So I find that political competitiveness impacts FEMA aid receipt. So conditional on having a fire, politically competitive counties are 3 times more likely to receive aid. I was a little surprised. I'd be very happy, but surprised that this is the case for even like a blue, like state like California, but there is a lot of variation in the county level for congressional seats and things like that. So actually like it does work, and a little concerning, but great for my research, I guess. So it does seem that this political competitiveness measure does impact your likelihood of receiving FEMA aid. The second concern, though, is that there's something else that's happening on this level that would impact my outcomes, like your migration outcomes, in ways that's like not the FEMA aid. So the exclusion restriction, the concern is that it impacts migration only through FEMA aid. Like the political competitiveness will only impact the outcome through this aid channel. So to try and address this, I think it's not possible to like fully test everything, but I do some tests to try and get at this. The first is that I look at other types of government spending on the county level. So I run a regression on those government spending on an indicator of whether the county had a fire, whether the whether the county is politically competitive and then an interaction of the two. And I find that the fire, like experiencing a fire, does increase the type of government spending that you have, but political competitiveness and that interaction term, you don't see any statistically significant impacts of that on other types of government spending. The only thing you do see is that an increase in like fire-related spending, which is exactly like the kind of aid that I'm trying to capture. Another concern could be that if you're politically competitive in a place like California, there might be differential beliefs about climate change. And so people might be updating differently, or that might impact their migration and likelihood of moving to safe places in a different way. So to get at this, the Yale has like a climate sentiment survey. And so I ran that same regression on a bunch of sentiments about climate change, and I don't see like a systematic difference in people's likelihood of believing in these statements that show support or denial of like climate change. So those are two tests at least that I think supports the story a little bit more, that politically competitiveness is only working through receiving this aid. And so here are the results. So the first box, the blue box, is whether you moved away from the tract. The left-hand side is the difference in differences study. And then the right-hand side is what happens when I instrument for aid. So you can see if I'm just comparing fires that have aid versus those that do not, you see that people are more likely to be moving away and people are more likely to be moving to these safe places. But after correcting for that endogeneity concern, I see an even larger effect on people's moving. So that suggests that maybe some people wanted to move, but they couldn't financially afford to. And so maybe aid could help them have that push to move to a different tract. But now there's no effect on being in a safe place. So it seems that adaptive migration is helping people move, but not necessarily to safe places. However, aid can impact people in other ways. And so I also look at some financial outcomes of the individual. So in particular, I construct two indices. The first is on financial distress. So I'm just combining a bunch of the credit panel outcomes that I have into a measure that is reflective of financial distress. And then also for one that's supposed to represent their access to credit. And so you can see on the left-hand side, if you don't correct, if you're just looking at what is the impact of aid, there's almost no effect on people's likelihood of having financial distress or their credit access. But after this instrument, you see this decrease in the likelihood of people falling into financial distress. And there's also this increase in their credit access. So even though maybe aid is not leading people to move to these safe places, it does seem to affect and help people's financial situation. And so that is something to think about, and to when we think about the role of aid and the impacts of it. And so in conclusion, there is migration after a fire, though it's not necessarily to safe places. And although people are more likely to move after a fire, they're not in safe areas in the longer term. Although they are, in tracts that are better in some other dimensions. So there's higher median income and average test scores, but they also happen to be higher housing costs, which could explain also the lower home ownership rates that we see for this population, even 4 years after. But those who are least likely to be financially constrained are more likely to be in these safe areas. And so we see that aid increases the likelihood of moving, but not to safe areas. And aid is, though, associated with people having lower financial distress. And so this is the portion where I talked about my job market paper and all of that. I was also told I could talk a little bit about my graduate school experience. So I have another slide about that. And so now I'm going to talk about surviving the fire of graduate school. Like Adriana said, I think my cohort and me in particular, I had a really hard time in grad school. And I came to UCLA actually with no funding, no guaranteed TA shifts. I just really wanted to do an economics PhD, and I loved LA. And so I had a leap of faith and I came here. I think in a lot of ways it was traumatic and stressful, but also like pushed me to seek out a lot of opportunities that ended up being super beneficial for me. And I think it made me be a lot more resilient. So like, for instance, because I didn't have any funding, pretty early on, I reached out to the California Policy Lab and asked to be an RA there because I had, to cover my bills. And I joined in my second year, and they just started having access to the address level data set that I was using. And so that became like the first pillar of my job market paper. And then because of those results that I found, I was thinking like, oh, it'd be interesting to look at other characteristics of that person. And so of like this type of migration. And then I applied for the UCCCP data, got access to it. And then like, this is where it came today. So I think like, if I hadn't not, I mean, I don't know what the counterfactual would have been, but it turned out great in a way that when I first came into the program, I might not have expected. And so I think that's the first piece of advice, is just to trust the process. I think like every day it can feel like a grind and you're not getting anywhere, but like if you're putting in the work and like trying and like sending out emails, like trying your best, like eventually something will convert, and like you will see the fruits of your labor. So that's the first point. I think the second one is I really highly recommend going to conferences and present your work. So I'm in the economics discipline. There's a lot of students. The faculty are wonderful, but they only have like one time a year when they can really listen to you. And so I think my advisor listens to me every week, so thank you, Adriana. But like, in order to, present to a lot of different people, it's really hard to. And so I am a person who, like, having to stand up and make a presentation and talk about things is very motivating for me. Also, being able to travel is very motivating for me. And so I think going to conferences was a great way to get my act together, to like assemble things and to get feedback from people outside of the department, and just like force me to practice and speak. Also, there's like a lot of fun conferences out there, so you can like combine it with like a little bit of a vacation. So I think that's like a nice little hack to get you motivated to go and do things. The third piece of advice would be to talk to people. So I had a hard time with this. I basically we had the first year and then COVID. And so my second year, when we're doing our field classes, was completely online. And the third year it was like very hard for me. And I was very scared of the professors. It was hard for me to go and talk to people. And I understand where I came from, but I think I kind of fell into a rut for a few years, and it would have been more helpful if I had actually gone and had the audacity in some ways to talk to the professors, just to ask for advice, and to ask for help. And so that not only means to your advisors, to professors, but also your classmates, people outside the program. I think the PhD is a very tiring, isolating time. And so it's very important to reach out and to ask for that support because we all need it. And then secondly, finding your mentors and your advisors. So I'm super grateful for my committee, especially Adriana. She saw me cry a lot of times and stuck with me. So I'm really grateful. But it was you have to have these people in your court that you really trust are fighting for you. And I think that makes this process feel a lot better. So knowing that you have, that you're not doing this alone. I think that was really important for me. The third piece of advice is try not to take things personally. I think that's really hard. And I think there's sometimes feedback isn't delivered in the kindest way. And so knowing how to take what's useful and disregard what's not, I think is a skill that I am still trying to do and trying to learn. But again, the rut that I fell into would have been a lot less painful if I could have taken this third point earlier. But of course, it is process. And yeah, our advisors, the professors know what's up. it can just sometimes feel a little painful when you've worked on something for a long time and then they like smash it in like the 5-minute meeting you're talking to them about. But again, it's like not personal, and maybe you can like find a different direction. So just like keep on working on that. And then finally, just like finding a community of people. And so like CCPR, it's a great chance. There's all these people from different disciplines. I'm so grateful for my cohort mates, my friends in economics, people outside of the program. I think it's just really, you need to remember that you are a person first and not this like research machine. And I think happy researchers are better researchers. And then finally, I think like I had to deliberately choose joy in my life. And so it sounds very dramatic, but there were some days where I was like, I can't focus, I can't do anything. And I refused to let myself feel guilty by taking a break, going to the beach, like go out to eat. I had a little tier list of things to make me happy, depending on how sad I was. So first tier was like get boba. If that didn't work, go to a nice restaurant. And then like go to karaoke. So like just find whatever works for you. And I think you just have to like remember who you are, really honor that. And we're so awesome and lucky to be in Los Angeles, and it's an amazing place. And so I think it's great to enjoy it. So I'm so grateful that I don't know, I've been reflecting a lot about my time at UCLA. I think there was a lot of hardships, but I'm really grateful to have gone through it and coming out of it. And I think like literally if I can do it, like everyone else can too. Like, so I just hope that everyone will, like you enjoyed the talk, if you have other questions, and I hope that you can look back on your chapter at UCLA as also a really beautiful time. Thank you.